Today's Jesus story features a Canaanite woman who is shouting, yelling, or crying out to Jesus for help. The Greek word for shouting, yelling, and crying out in Matthew is kratzo. And it comes up quite a bit in Matthew's gospel. Some of us react immediately to the idea of being shouted at, or the idea of hearing yelling, or to the very horrible thought of being so needy that we would cry out for help. Shouting, yelling, crying out bring to mind things like getting in trouble, emergencies, and tragedy. This woman is not the only woman who shouts in Matthew's version of the Jesus story. There are many people who shout or cry out for help. There is a demon who shouts at Jesus. There are two pairs of blind men who cry out for Jesus' help. There is Peter's shout last week when he was trying to walk on the water. He was walking on the water, and then he cried out to Jesus as he began to sink into the Sea of Galilee after that fleeting moment of divinity that he shared with Christ. And then there are children in Matthew's gospel who shout out, "Hosanna, Hosanna," in Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. And there are crowds, angry crowds, who shout, "Crucify him." Many different types of people cry out for the attention of Jesus, even shouting at him, yelling for him in Matthew. Today we hear the voice of an unnamed Canaanite woman shouting out, crying to Jesus for help. As a Canaanite woman, we know she's a Gentile. She is not in the same cultural tradition of the Israelite people, the people who took over the land of Canaan when Joshua and his army left the wilderness and conquered the promised land, originally Canaanite land. Jesus doesn't seem interested in responding to her shouts and yells and cries, nor are his disciples. Jesus and the Canaanite woman have this snappy section of dialogue in the form of a dog analogy. Now, being compared to a dog is not a great thing. Growing up, I can remember that popular put down, "She's such a dog," meaning that somebody was unattractive. So why would Jesus compare this pleading woman to a dog? Could it be for her loyalty, her devotion to her daughter? Or could it reveal that Jesus did not understand her and her culture, that she was foreign to him? Chances are good that Jesus did not grow up with a pet dog. In the typical Jewish home, there would not be any pets. Now, in a Greek, Roman, or Canaanite home, dogs were much more common. So in this snappy dog exchange, this Canaanite woman is educating Jesus about pet culture, about how dinner time actually works in the home, as the children at the table and the dogs are both getting their fill of food, some on the table, some falling to the ground. There is this cross-cultural exchange happening here about pets, and Jesus is the one being taught. This cross-cultural exchange opens Jesus up to the Canaanite woman, and he realizes that she has great faith in God's power, and he heals her daughter sight unseen. It's amazing. The Canaanite woman persists with her faithful shouts, motivated by love for her daughter and motivated by probably exhaustion and despair in her situation. She persists in this cross-cultural exchange and demonstrates a faith so great that Jesus names it and heals her daughter from afar. She is not the first Canaanite in the Jesus story, according to Matthew. The first Canaanite woman mentioned in Matthew's gospel is way back in chapter 1, in the genealogy of Jesus. Her name is Rahab, and she is one of only 4 female ancestors mentioned in the 42 generations included in Jesus' genealogy. Matthew includes a long genealogy to firmly weave Jesus into the context of God's ongoing love for God's people, God's ongoing acts of faithfulness. So Rahab's Canaanite DNA, if you will, is a part of who Jesus is understood to be in our story. And I wonder if that ever occurred to Jesus as he tried to ignore this Canaanite woman in front of him. I wonder if at some moment in their exchange, Jesus remembers. He remembers the faithful persistence of his 40th great-grandmother, Rahab. Rahab was a woman of questionable reputation who lived in a home in the wall of the city of Jericho when Joshua sent 2 spies to check the city out. Joshua, who took over leadership of the Israelite enterprise to conquer Jericho and the Promised Land after Moses, sent 2 spies in for recon work before they attempted to take over the city and the whole surrounding area. The spies stay with Rahab, and while staying with Rahab, the Jericho city officials hear that 2 strangers have come into their city, and they knock on Rahab's door. She hides the 2 spies under her recently harvested flax. It's drying up on the roof. And she makes up a story that satisfies the officials, who then go off in a different direction searching for these spies. During that dark of night, that same night, while she's hiding these men, Rahab sits down on her rooftop next to her drying flax and hidden visitors and enters into an exchange with the spies about God, the people of the spies, the future of her city, about the future of her own self and her family. She tells them, "Look, I know who you are. I know who your God is. I know about Egypt. You're coming to take over our city, and I believe you're going to win. Will you spare me and my family?" She persists in seeking safety for her family and for herself, and the 2 spies agree that their armies will pass over her home and leave it and its inhabitants undisturbed if, and only if, Rahab hangs a crimson cord out the window of her home, right there in the city wall, where the invading Israelites can see it. In this way, Rahab persists to save her family and becomes a part of the community of Israelites that settle in Jericho. She marries an Israelite and has the child Boaz. And Boaz has a child named Obed with the Moabite woman named Ruth, who is the grandfather of King David. This somewhat scandalous woman, Rahab, a Canaanite, maybe a prostitute, a traitor to her own city, persisted in protecting the spies, persisted to save her family, and became the great-great-grandmother of Israel's much-beloved king and an ancestor to Jesus. This Canaanite ancestor, Rahab, who saved her family with that crimson cord, ties Jesus to this woman before him in today's story, a Canaanite woman who will persist for her family, who will shout to get Jesus' attention because her daughter needed his life-saving power. In this interaction, Jesus enlarges his ministry beyond his own cultural group, the Jewish community. He has come to act for all people, to save all people, Jewish or Gentile, all people, ritually pure or scandalously impure, all people. This Canaanite woman is helpful to Jesus in enlarging his plan of salvation, much like Rahab is helpful to Joshua, who sent the spies. Fun fact, the word for Joshua and Jesus are the same word. It's Yeshua, Joshua, Jesus. It's the same name. Jesus recognizes her great faith, much as Joshua and his spies recognize the loyalty of Rahab. Throughout the generations, God honors the faithful who persist for love. Isn't that good news? Here we are, the people of God, persisting in our struggles and sometimes crying out to God for help, sometimes shouting or yelling at God in our frustration, in our desperation, faithful to God faithful to the love we share with our families and our communities and the society around us, the world around us, in the ways that we are able. We are God's honored people of faith, persisting for love, day in and day out. Pandemic or no pandemic. It's just who we are. It's in our spiritual DNA. We persist by returning again and again to the God who loves us and engages with us and heals us. If you've ever thought that God was ignoring your cries for help, I invite you to claim this unnamed Canaanite woman as your champion. Stick with it. Keep praying, keep crying out, and very important, keep listening, just as she listened and responded to Jesus. Persist. Stay engaged with God, even when it seems like nothing is happening. Know that there is this invisible cord connecting you to all those who have pestered Jesus for help, who have cried, "Please, please, intervene in my struggle, Lord." My dear friends in faith, persist for love's sake. Shout if you must. Jesus persisted in his ministry out of love for us all. The last time we hear shouting in Matthew's gospel is at the very end of Jesus' life, his earthly life. He hangs on a cross that Good Friday afternoon, and he cries out, he shouts with a loud voice to God. And then finally he cries out one last time with a loud voice and breathes his last. After the resurrected Christ appears to the women and other disciples, and they experience how God persists even over death out of great love for us all, he reminds them in the very last words of the gospel text. He says this, "Remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." God remains with us, engaged in this with us. And so we remain with God. We will persist for love's sake.